We heard that from Donald Trump. Later on, it's going to be Kamala Harris who's going to be giving that one of her big closing address at a rally that's planned, as we were hearing a little bit earlier on. Donald Trump, first of all, it was very Donald Trump, that address. He did turn to the border, he turned to the economy, and I think some of his people have been keen that he do that. A good swipe at Harris as well. Maybe what was missing was also interesting. What was not in his contribution today, because the news this week has been so dominated by that New York rally, where we had those, well, plainly racist jokes aimed at Latino voters. An odd thing to hear at a rally of a party that wants Latino votes in the American election. And we're still waiting to see what sort of fallout may flow from that. Will it put many Latino voters off voting Republican who might otherwise have voted for Donald Trump? We have to wait and see where that's concerned. But there was speculation, wasn't there, Julie, that would Donald Trump do anything to row back on those remarks, the way that his campaign has tried to disown those remarks? And of course he didn't, because Donald Trump, Julie, does not do contrition, does he?
He doesn't. At least he didn't today. He has just distanced himself from that comedian, from that speaker, saying he didn't know them, he didn't hear the remarks, but he didn't even go as far as his own campaign did when his campaign said that these remarks do not reflect the views of President Trump and the Trump campaign, despite the fact you have not only had Democrats but a number of pro-Trump Republican allies and in and out of the Hispanic and Latino community here in the U.S. who have called on the former president to disavow those remarks and essentially apologize for having that speaker there in the first place. In Florida, for example, my home state, my hometown, Orlando, Florida, is home to a very large Puerto Rican population, and you have a number of Florida Republicans and Democrats really, voicing concern over these remarks. Senator Rick Scott, for example, the former governor of Florida, someone who has a lot of ties to Puerto Rico and the Puerto Rican community. You will remember during the Trump administration, there was Hurricane Maria, and a number of Puerto Ricans were displaced and eventually resettled in Florida. Rick Scott, a Republican, pro-Trump Republican, condemning those remarks. You have Congressman Carlos Jimenez from the Miami area. He is also condemning those remarks. But, you also have the political part of this and how this could impact the election. Remember, this election is all about the margins. It's all about winning over these slivers of the electorate. Even if you don't win the majority of a certain group, if you get a certain number of voters from a certain voting block, that could end up making a major difference. And if you look at Pennsylvania itself, more specifically, Philadelphia, you have a pretty significant number of Puerto Rican voters. And we know that in general, Puerto Ricans have tended to lean more to the left or voted more liberally in the past, but Donald Trump was looking to make inroads with them, like he has with the rest of the Hispanic and Latino community and voting blocks within that community. So this, on the onset at least, would do nothing to win over those voters. Now, on top of that, you have a lot of these undecided swing independent voters who may or may not be Hispanic or Latino, who are looking at the Trump campaign and may say, hey, I liked the economy under Donald Trump. I like his policies on immigration or his policies on this or that, but I don't like the chaos. I don't like the distractions. I don't like the circus. And this right here is a major distraction.
Yeah.
Instead of being able to talk about the economy and policies, Donald Trump is being forced to talk about this, and he's digging in.
Yeah, I mean, I want to bring in Rachel and Tim in a second, but listening to Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago a little bit earlier on, there was a lot of bemoaning the absence of Joe Biden, said he'd been removed by a coup. Again, what's the point of that? I mean, who is he trying to appeal to with that? Or is it Donald Trump wishing that he was running against Joe Biden, which he now is not?
I think it's maybe a little bit of both. I think, you've heard this narrative from Republicans for a few months now, going back to when Harris became the presumptive Democratic nominee back in July, essentially saying she was made that nominee undemocratically, saying she was put there. There wasn't really a real primary. The problem with that argument, though, is that she didn't have any challengers. I mean, the progressive wing of the party had ample enough opportunity to put forth their own challenger and to, push back on Harris. And we have seen some of that pushback on a number of issues, like, for example, the war in the Middle East, the war in Gaza, with Vice President Harris's role in the Biden administration. But, that argument isn't really sticking. And it's also ironic because we know that Donald Trump and so many Republicans were, they wanted to run against Joe Biden because he was perceived as a weaker candidate. But they felt that, they were saying it's a risk to have someone that old, or in their words, mentally incompetent at the top of the ticket or in the presidency.
I do want to sort of explore some of your instincts and maybe a bit of your educated guesswork in a moment about where we are with this race, which could not be any closer. Rachel's here, Tim's here. Rachel.
It's just really interesting, like the run up to it. Obviously, these comments by this comedian are a major story, particularly because of the voter demographic that they were targeted at. And I take the point about Puerto Ricans being a significant voting bloc in Florida or in Pennsylvania. But just having been following this for the last year, is there really anything between now and Tuesday that you think that anyone thinks could change it? I mean, voters seem to, the number of voters who seem undecided, to genuinely don't know which side they're going to vote for, must be vanishingly small. I know the polls are difficult to read. I know it's very difficult because they're different demographics, different states. It's a sort of pollster's nightmare. But do we really think that anything between now and next Tuesday could move the dial?
Julie?
I think it's a very, very small number of voters, first of all. I mean, I'm going to reference a poll from a week ago, a national poll that, sort of in their sample size had about 6% undecided voters. That number could be larger, it could be a little smaller, but I would guess it's around that ballpark generally. And there's also the question of, are these voters who are saying they are undecided, do they lean one way or lean the other? It seems to be conventional wisdom that most of this is baked in for voters now. But I think there are still undecided voters. Not only undecided in terms of, am I going to vote for Kamala Harris or am I going to vote for Donald Trump, but also voters who may lean towards, let's say, Kamala Harris, but they may say, I don't know if I'm going to go out and vote. I don't know if I'm, going to put in that effort, even to vote earlier, to go to my polling precinct on election day. And remember, the decision not to vote is sort of a major decision in itself. It plays into the final count. So I think that plays into this as well.
Tim.
Excuse me, we say the election is nearly over, and of course in one way it will be next Tuesday, but there's lots of speculation about how both sides will react to defeat. And I wonder whether you can tell us anything at all about what preparations are being made by law enforcement and perhaps the grandees of America, if there are such people who can reach across the aisle, to calm what, from the side of the Atlantic, seems a very unhappy, divided nation. And whoever wins, it's going to be on a small margin.
Yeah.
And politics just seems to have become far too important in America. Elections matter much more than they ever used to. And that's not healthy. And what is the scale of preparation, if you know, to the outcome?
It's large scale preparations. I mean, I'm talking to you and I am just roughly, a few blocks from the Capitol building. If you walk out of my office right now, the Capitol building is right there.
Yeah.
So, and, I remember 4 years
Better
ago.
protected than 4 years ago, yeah.
Exactly, right. And I remember 4 years ago in the aftermath of January 6th, I mean, that entire complex was completely fenced off. And I think law enforcement certainly is more prepared this time. I think, for example, Washington, D.C. itself, I'm a resident of Washington, D.C., so this is something I'm personally concerned with, is also, from what I understand, there are preparations underway. But there's also, I mean, look, there's concerning, signs out there. Like you hear, for example, of the in the Pacific Northwest, there have been stories or accounts of ballot boxes that have been lit on fire in the past couple of days. So there's certainly a lot of concerning signs. And we know that, the FBI has been working to, sort of prevent any possible plots. It seems that, any we hear a lot about outside election interference, but there really does seem to be a concern this time around, considering what happened 4 years ago, about anything happening from within, really, among Americans, any domestic extremism, that kind of a thing. So I think law enforcement is certainly more prepared this time, but it's hard to figure out what we should be prepared for. I mean, the environment already is so different from what it was 4 years ago already. So I think there is a preparation, but still a lot of uncertainty. And it's not just preparations being made here in Washington, D.C. I would imagine in states across the country, this will be, of concern as well.
Julie, always a pleasure. Let's talk again soon. I
Thank
hope
you.
I'm going to be there, right there in Philadelphia in a very few days' time. Thought in from Jonathan in Dulwich. Seems to think I'm maybe being a bit tough on Donald Trump. He says, would you ever say it's Harris being Harris in the way that you say it's Trump being Trump? Probably the answer to that is maybe I wouldn't. Because, I mean, can anyone think of a candidate in a race like this whose character is so synonymous with who he is, his politics, his plans for the presidency, and what the presidency would become were this man to be the president? I can't think of any parallel to remotely compare with him in that way. Donald Trump is in that way somewhat unique in modern history, unless, Tim, you want to disagree.
Well, it's completely unique, but I tell you just a little thing that is never really covered by British media is, and I heard it all of the time when I was in America in 2016 covering the Trump-Clinton election for the Times. People talked incessantly about how politicians arrived in Washington not very wealthy and all left wealthy. It's a huge issue for the average Americans. They think their whole system is corrupt. Look at Biden, look at Pelosi. They have enriched themselves through politics. K Street, the lobbying arm in Washington, is huge. The number of lobbyists per senator is like 12 to 1, I think, just for pharmaceuticals or something. The American people think their politicians are absolutely corrupt. And so they take that as read. And so one of the reasons they like Trump is he's already rich. He can't be corrupt.
I mean, he's not as rich as he says he is.
Oh, he's definitely not as rich as he says he is. But I wonder sometimes, John, whether we look at enough at why people who know Trump is racist, they don't like it and they're still willing to vote for him.
Oh,
because
sure.
it's always a vote of lesser two evils.
Oh, for sure. And that's part of the mission. That's part of what we do. And certainly part of my mission in these coming weeks is to talk about not just how people are going to vote, which is what we do at elections, but also why they're going to vote. But just on the point that you made there, I mean, I wouldn't make that distinction too firmly, because, I mean, you could put a stack of evidence together that thick on examples of Donald Trump being said to have enriched himself personally through the presidency, channeling federal money into his own businesses and pocket in a way that I can't think of too many parallels that go precisely alongside that. However, your point about the motivation of the American voter is absolutely fascinating and very much bears exploring, and that's part of what we're going to be keen to do.